In this video we'll be showing outputs from a recent Heritage Lottery project by the Word Garden. The project is called The Adventurers, a New Exploration of the Archives, and was carried out by Peter Daldorf, me, Jean Rees, who created the Word Garden, Nicola Power and Elizabeth Harrington. This project follows a previous National Heritage Lottery Fund project called Origins, and this was about the Scottish prisoners of war who were deployed in the drainage of the Fens in the 1650s. In carrying out this project, we did a great deal of research into the archives that are held in Ely, and as we did this we found out many other really interesting stories from the time. And because the previous project was very much focused on the Scottish soldiers, we didn't explore these in any great depth. But we were keen to do so and therefore applied for another Heritage Lottery Fund project, and we're lucky to be successful. And as I said before, in this talk I'll be presenting outputs from this project. If you want to learn more about the Word Garden, just visit the website shown here, thewordgarden.org.uk, and this will show you other projects, not just the Scottish soldier ones, but other ones that the Word Garden have carried out over the years. The philosophy of the Word Garden is not only to discover and share hidden histories, but also to try to bring them to life in different ways, to try to help people imagine what it was like for those who came before us in the past. It's very difficult, of course, but through exploring different media we hope we can reveal history in new ways. And hopefully that's what we've done in this case. The archives that we looked at for the Scottish Soldier project, and the archives that have been the main focus for this project, as shown on this slide, these are the proceedings of the adventurers between 1649 and 1656. As I said before, they're held in the Cambridgeshire Archives in Ely, available to anyone who wants to look at them, and they record the minutes of the company of adventurers. Over this period they met roughly every 2 or 3 days. There were bigger gaps at times. Overall there were over 800 meetings, and that's covered by about 700 pages of these documents, roughly 350,000 words. Now these archives have been looked at on many occasions by different historians and people with interest. Notably they're referred to in a book by Samuel Wells, which was written in the early 19th century about the history of drainage of the Bedford Level. Also other more recent books by Keith Lindsay, Eric Ashe. These previous books don't really give the full story. For example, Samuel Wells, he really didn't record anything that made the Bedford Corporation look bad, because he was an employee of the Bedford Corporation. So some of the things I found about corruption, about riots amongst the workers, he didn't really include in his records. Keith Lindsay, his book was very particular, looking at the riots. Eric Ashe is a much broader look, but he also covered the whole history of drainage, so obviously a lot of information to cover there. These are some of the project outputs. So on the left hand side we can see there are 5 documents, transcriptions of each of the books that I just showed in the previous slide. As well as that, we've created what I've called a summary and index, but it is actually quite a long account of the contents of the minute books. As you might imagine, minutes of meetings as they are today are a bit fragmented, so they only discuss what happened to be important on the day. So therefore it's all a bit bitty, and what I've tried to do in this document is to sort of bring it together under themes, so it can be read in that sort of order rather than in its actual original order. In addition to the transcription, we've also created maps of what the Great Level was like at different points in the history, who owned the land, what type of land it was, etc. I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So that's kind of the evidence. But also we did some other things. So we created a history walk. So this was near to Erith, where a lot of the key events occurred in the drainage. We did the work with the Fen Edge, who created lots of maps around the edge of the Fens. Mostly the focus of those is geology, but in this case they kindly agreed to do this one with us to look at the history of this part of the Great Level. And alongside the maps and the walk guide that you can see there, we created a history audio blog or talk. So at each point as you go around the different stops on the walk, you can hear a bit about what happened in those places over 350 years ago. And as well as that, we created 3 audio dramas on different topics, again just to look at the history in a different way, to try to bring it to life to different people. Those plays cover the following topics. So the first was the Scottish soldiers, using some of the material from the previous project, also the riots at Swaffham, which were a key moment in the story, and also correspondence between 2 of the key adventurers, Robert Henley and Anthony Hammond. They last between about 20 minutes and 40 minutes, so hopefully you can listen to those as well. Now what I'm going to show you in this talk is a very quick run through some of the key events that are in these archives. But these are covered in much more detail in the documents, as I mentioned. As you can see on this page, there's some of the first pages in the summary document. The text is about 60 pages long. There's lots of appendices with further details. If you read these minute books and look at some of these other documents, you can take a real deep dive into the past. And the minute books, although there's quite long sections that are not particularly interesting to do with land transactions and things like this, if you read the whole, you really do build up a picture of the world in those times. Many thousands of people worked on this project, the drainage project. All kinds of people, from the highest people in the land, Cromwell, and some of the Council of State were involved, all the way down to the poorest. It was a real cross-section of society. What I'm going to show you now is a video, and what I want to do is just try to think about what the Fens was like before drainage. And what we'll be looking at is from the current day in Biebrzę marshes in Poland. And in my view, this is probably the place in the world most like the pre-drained Fens. The climate's quite similar. They're kind of managed in a similar way to the old Fens. So I'll just show you the video now. The river rises up, and because the rivers aren't embanked like they are today, the water just spreads out across the land in a very shallow flooding. And then as winter passes, the water level falls, and this is when the people put their cattle on what was called in the Fens the summer grounds, but something very similar occurs in Biebrzę marshes. One thing that's clear from this is cattle actually are used to wet conditions. They seem to cope quite well under wet conditions. In the winter, huge areas of shallow flooding can freeze and then snowed upon. As well, there were in the Biebrzę, as there was in the Fens, there were these causeways across the shallow areas where people could walk from place to place. And then in the spring, there's a great burgeoning of life, and of course, great amounts of wildlife, immense flocks of wildfowl, bigger than we can kind of imagine today, just enormous numbers of wildfowl, and fish and other game. These just show some pictures of the wildfowl in Biebrzę, but if you imagine, these scenes would have spread over hundreds of square miles of fen. Now we're moving forward in time. This map shows the Great Level before the drainage, and on the map you can see different colours. So there's large areas of common. Some of the land was more divided up into smaller plots, usually close to the rivers. There were small towns that you can see, and meres, which have all disappeared now, the large meres like Whittlesea Mere and Sower Mere. This map is based on 3 separate maps. So there's William Hayward's map of 1604 that was created before much of the drainage work had taken place. There was Jonas Moore's map of 1657, so he did this for the adventurers, and this shows where the plots of land were that were allocated to the adventurers. A very detailed map, a very fine map, and an amazing map really in terms of what he created in an area that had so little previous geographical information. The final map was current Google satellite maps. And the amazing thing is, many of the drains and land holdings that were created in the 1650s can still be seen in the modern landscape. And our map was created by combining the information largely in Jonas Moore's map, and to some extent William Hayward's, with how things lay in the modern Fens. This just shows an example. So the grey area there that the arrow points to shows an area of adventurers' lands, and that was marked, divided into lots of lots. So there's about 6 or 7 there, all allocated to different adventurers. But if you look closely at the underlying layer, you can see the land divisions between the fields is still the same as the original lots. And those were drawn out by drains built by the adventurers and Jonas Moore, who kind of measured out this land. Also, many of the old river channels, although they're largely extinct, they can still be seen as traces in the colour of the soil and how the field boundaries are laid out, because when they were originally there, obviously the fields were bordered by the water channels. So it's amazing, although the Fens has transformed, there's still a trace, like a kind of ghostly trace of what was left before. And we've created GIS layers. This is a GIS map. You need a GIS package to look at it, but this is in QGIS, and this is free to download. It's very, very useful, a piece of software. It's very good. It's used for many different projects, and all the files I've created are available to download. I'll come on to that at the end of the talk. Moving on in time now to 1649. This is when our project started, when the minute book started. So even before 1649, there were some major works on the drainage in the first undertaking. So you can see on this map, there was Old Bedford River, a very long river running between Erith and Denver and Salter's Lode. Also Bevil's Lean was created. Many of the drains around the Nene were created well before this period. Now, in the first undertaking, that took place in the 1630s, and it was led by Francis Russell, who was the father of the Earl of Bedford, who managed the later works that we'll be looking at. They did a lot of work, they spent a lot of money, but eventually it was adjudged by the Law Commissions, who were appointed by Parliament to make this decision, that the drainage was incomplete, and consequently the adventurers did not receive their reward of land. So they spent a huge amount of money, but they did not receive their recompense of land, which was fairly disastrous for them. Now, immediately after this, all the events of the Civil War unfolded. The drainage works that they did work on fell into a state of disrepair. And this is the situation that the later project inherited. A lot of the men were the same as in the previous undertaking, not all of them, some of them had died, and their aim was really to finally complete the drainage and gain the recompense of land that was their objective in the first place. And it's 95,000 acres of land that they were to be given, so that's a very large recompense of great value. Again, setting the scene, the Act of Drainage was passed in Parliament in May 1649. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of dispute before this happened. There was many against the drainage and others for it. There were kind of issues around how the process was managed and influenced behind the scenes. For example, a lot of the commoners felt badly done by because they went to London to make their case, but then were told it was postponed, they had to go back, they had to come back again. In the end, it was very difficult for them to make their case. Also, 4 months before this, Charles I was executed. The Commonwealth had just been formed, England was ruled by Parliament and the Council of State. So this period that we're looking at was preceded by a great period of turmoil and trauma. In the Civil War, more people died as a proportion of the population than in the First World War. And in 1649, this was not the end of the Civil War. The war moved out, really, to Ireland, where Cromwell and his troops seized control and against the Scots. And that really continued until 1652. So the Civil War, although not really taking place in England in this time, continued through our period. On the slide we can see the Act of Drainage, and also this is the first entry in the minute books in May 1649, the day the Drainage Act was passed, and here they actually thank Lieutenant General Cromwell and Commissary Ireton for their help in achieving the Act of Drainage, which is interesting because Cromwell previously had often made a case against some of the drainage works, but in here there's clear evidence that he supported the works. So who were the adventurers? They were wealthy men, mostly based in London, politicians, landowners. Many were in the Council of State, many more were members of Parliament, and the company was led by the Earl of Bedford, the son of the previous chairman of the company. If you put it into today's context, these men would be members in the cabinet, they'd be at the head of large corporations. They were the most powerful men in England, mostly on the parliamentary side, with some exceptions. The letter that you can see contains the signature of many of the adventurers. You can pick some out. There's Edward Partherich, Bedford, John Thurlow, etc. Some were sent down into the Great Level to manage the works. They called that being resident on the works. And notably those included Anthony Hammond, John Thurlow and John Latch. John Thurlow was a very interesting man. At the start in 1649 he was not a hugely important man. He was an associate of Oliver St John, the Lord Chief Justice, but by the end he was a very important man. He was Secretary of State. He was essentially Cromwell's right-hand man, very close to Cromwell, and he was Cromwell's spy master, so he did intercepted letters, he gained intelligence for Cromwell. He was a very influential and fascinating man. But he was involved in the drainage. Other important men, Robert Henley, he was one of the wealthiest of the men. He was very influential in Parliament. Oliver St John, as I mentioned before, he was in the Council of State, he was Lord Chief Justice. So these are really important people at the time. The number of adventurers, in fact, changed through the years, because to be an adventurer you had to be allocated one of the lots of land that would be awarded once the drainage was complete. But ownership of these lots moved around, because if they couldn't pay taxes they were sold to others. In overall, over 200 men are mentioned as adventurers in the minute books. The next topic I'll turn to is how the drainage was financed. So this map shows the grey areas are the areas allocated to the adventurers, the 95,000 acres of land, and as you can see they're distributed around the level into quite small units. There's 20 lots, each of 4,000 acres, and there was an additional 15,000 acres that was originally largely allocated to King Charles, but of course he'd just been executed. Those were sold to other businessmen and landowners to raise money for the project. Now the money was raised by raising taxes on each acre of land. So the more land owned, the more taxes would be paid by that person. And they raised many taxes. Often, though, the adventurers failed to pay their taxes, either because they didn't want to or because they didn't have the funds. And when this happened, the Drainage Act allowed the company to sell the land and take the money from the debt from that sale value, and then the rest of the money would go back to the original owner. A lot of the minute book is dedicated to describing these changes of land, defaulters' land as they describe it. And many exchanges took place. The company had great problems raising finance. On several occasions they essentially ran out of money. Early on in the process particularly, they couldn't get the other adventurers to pay their taxes, and when they tried to sell the land, no one wanted to buy it. And in 1649, the project came very near to collapsing. They even put lots of posters up around London and Westminster asking if they could find people who would be willing to buy the land. On several occasions, they had to raise money by taking loans from some of the more wealthy members of the adventurers that they paid back later, just to keep the finances going so they could carry on paying the workers and so forth. This chart shows the money raised in taxes. It isn't the total amount, because there was some money raised elsewhere, for example the sale of the King's land. On the left hand side, that's money in pounds, and on the bottom it's going through time. The dotted orange line is the estimate that Sir Cornelius Vermuyden made on how much he believed it would cost. And as you can see, by the middle of 1651 they'd already reached that sum. By the end they'd spent around 200,000. The points with the arrows mark the first adjudication, and that was when the northern area of the Great Level was judged to be drained by the commissioners. The final adjudication for the whole level took place in 1653. After the final adjudication, as you can see, the company essentially stopped spending money. They maybe thought the work was largely over, but in fact there was still a lot more to do. This led to Oliver St John overturning the management of the company. As you can see, shortly after that, more taxes were raised to pay for more work. As I said, many times the adventurers were in default and land was sold. The King's land was sold. And again, the company ran into lots of problems with money. This was a topic of maybe half of the minute book, trying to deal with their finances. So how was the works organised? Well, it was led by the Earl of Bedford through these meetings. This is when the meetings in the minute books, this is where the decisions were made. The numbers varied at those meetings. Sometimes there were just 4 or 5 people, and other times it went up to 30 or so. The company made decisions, and those were passed on to the adventurers who were resident in the Fens, and they organised the works. And quite a lot of the minute books is a correspondence between the adventurers in London and those that were resident in the Fens. Now, alongside those adventurers who were present in the Fens were officers who were paid by the company. These included people like overseers, who kind of looked after the works in detail, the site managers in the modern world, also surveyors like Jonas Moore and his team. There were clerks, there were other people who managed contracts. Overall, though, the number of officers in the Fens who were paid by the company rarely exceeded 30. A handful of people, really, when you consider the enormity of the project. In comparison to this, the number of actual workers, labourers, probably got up to about 15,000 in 1651. An enormous workforce of labourers, similar in size to some of the armies that fought in the Civil War. So there's a great disparity between the number of officers and the number of labourers, and this was filled by a group called the Takers, and they were essentially like gang masters in the modern world. They organised the labourers, gathered them together, and then interacted with the officers and the adventurers in the Fens, and for that they took a cut. The company didn't really want this to happen, because they were spending enormous amounts on labourers. Most of that expenditure of £200,000 was on labourers, and the Takers were taking a cut of up to a third, even a half of this. So it's a huge loss of money to the company. On several occasions they complain about this. They'd much rather try to employ the labourers directly, but it proved very difficult, and there was different disputes with the Takers. Also was Cornelius Vermuyden. His job was to direct the works, design the engineering, where the drains would go, how wide they were, where to put sluices, where to build banks, etc. Now, he had a difficult relationship to the company that I'll go on to shortly, but his contract was specifically for this design work. They didn't want him employing people, they didn't want him making arrangements and contracts and so forth. They specifically said he shouldn't do this, but he did get more involved in the detail than they wanted, and there are lots of disputes between Cornelius Vermuyden and the company. The company had many problems in delivering this great project, and to put this into context, this was by far the largest engineering project in the history of England. There was no real precedent. Other drainage projects had taken place, but not on this scale. Just to organise the finance, organise the enormity of the workforce was extremely challenging. Not just in money, but in terms of project management. They had great difficulties controlling Sir Cornelius Vermuyden. Finding competent officers, people skilled to manage and also do the technical work, was very difficult. There was lots of corruption, lots of problems with corruption. As I mentioned before, how they dealt with the takers was a real problem. The logistics was a huge problem. Just to move things around such a vast area with a very poor transport network was very difficult. All communications really took place by letters, moving back and forth from London, which is not an efficient process, bearing in mind the huge scale of the works dotted all around the great level. So moving on, now we'll look at some of the key people who were involved in the actual drainage works. If you ever ask people, particularly in the Fens, about the drainage works, the early drainage works, often Sir Cornelius Vermuyden is mentioned. He is really the most known figure. That doesn't necessarily mean he was the most important, but he was most remembered. He had a very difficult relationship with the company, and there's lots of details about this in the minute books. His contract negotiations were very long and difficult. It was largely about how much his remuneration would be, but also who had control. So he did not want people in London, the adventurers, meddling with his work. But likewise, they did not want to give him a free rein, because there was huge amounts of money, their money, that was being spent. So they wanted to have some control of that process. And there was a real standoff between these views. It became very testy. On many occasions, they agreed to have nothing to do with each other. Vermuyden had a bit of history as well. He'd worked previously on other drainage projects in Yorkshire, on the Thames, also for the King. Just before the Civil War, the King took over the drainage for a short period, and he employed Vermuyden. So they knew about him. He wasn't new to the adventurers, and he was a difficult character. It's fairly clear. There's many parts of the minute book where the company are expressing dissatisfaction with Vermuyden. I'll give you some examples. So, in 1650, towards the end, there was a problem near Wisbeach. The water levels were getting very high. Anthony Hammond cut through a bank to lower the pressure. Vermuyden immediately told the workers to reverse what Hammond had done, and the company immediately contacted Vermuyden to say he had to follow their orders, and those orders were Anthony Hammond to make this cut. Vermuyden pushed back against this, then they ordered him again that they had to follow, according to their articles of agreement, he had to follow what they wanted. An even more remarkable example was the 100-foot river during its construction in 1651. The company wanted the workforce to be in the northern area of their level that had just been adjudged to be drained and complete the drainage works there so that the adventurers could start making use of their land. Although it had been allocated, it hadn't been laid out in terms of the divisions between the land, roads hadn't been built, so they couldn't really make the profits that they wanted from it. So they were very keen for that to happen, whereas Vermuyden was very keen for the work to continue. So he started the work building the 100-foot river and developing a big workforce to do that. And the company again and again told him not to do this, but to move the workers north. And this went on for most of the summer. In the end, the company actually said, we will not pay any of the workers in the south level, where Vermuyden wanted them deployed, and said they'll only pay them if they move to the north level. The amazing thing is, this biggest part of the project, involving 11,000 men, was carried out against the company's will. And by the time that any sort of resolution was gained, they'd largely finished the cutting of the drain. A similar event occurred at the Marston Cut. The company wanted it cut. It's up near King's Lynn. Vermuyden didn't want it done that way. There's again another standoff. Again, the pattern emerges. Vermeulen had his own view, the company had their view, and they just didn't agree. And Vermeulen was very unwilling to do what the company wanted him to do. Another thing that annoyed the company greatly was that Vermeulen was very often not in the level. He was elsewhere, as in London or other parts of England, looking at other projects and other business dealings. And they wrote to him on many occasions expressing their great dissatisfaction that he was not present in the level. And they eventually forced him, I think, to be there more often. This sour relationship was held together early on by the fact that Vermeulen was really the only person who had the knowledge and skill to deliver the project. So however much he annoyed the company, they didn't really have a choice but to continue with him. But as time went by, others were working on the drainage every day. They were developing skills and knowledge. Vermeulen was often not there, and really the centre of power in terms of controlling the works shifted away from him, and he became increasingly marginalised. They began to doubt his skills as well and wanted others to check his proposals increasingly. As time went on, his influence grew less and less. There was an interesting incident that occurred in 1954 where Vermeulen wrote to the company saying he wanted to gather a large meeting to inform them of the state of the drainage. Lots gathered, and then he didn't turn up for that meeting. We don't know the reasons. They wrote to him saying they were very annoyed about this, that he must attend the meetings, and they asked him to put everything in writing. That doesn't ever seem to have been resolved. That meeting doesn't seem to have taken place. The other dispute with Vermeulen was that he didn't pay his taxes. So after the final adjudication, according to his contract, he had to pay taxes. He simply didn't pay the taxes. And there are other disputes related to this. His name appears less and less as the minutes go on. The last date he features in the minute books is early in 1656 when his lands were sold. He actually attended that meeting when his lands were sold. I'll just mention some of the other key people in the drainage, some more known than others. So Jonas Moore, he was the company's principal surveyor. He led a small team of under-surveyors, and their job was to measure out the drains and the banks, where to put them. It was to create division dikes, as they called them, that marked out the divisions between each plot of land. Any work that they had done, they had surveyed to make sure it had been done properly, and as well more created maps like the one that we can see here. His map is a remarkable map with enormous levels of detail and remarkable degree of accuracy, bearing in mind how primitive in some ways the surveying methods were. And remember, this landscape was a very wide open landscape with very few landmarks to triangulate against to mark out where everything was. Another thing to bear in mind is he was going out with his small team of workers into this open, wild place, great commons, used by the commoners for many centuries. Hardly surprisingly, they became very annoyed when they saw a gang of surveyors, much like you could imagine would happen today, marking out the land that they had considered theirs, essentially, or for their own use for many centuries. And there was significant stir and tumult from the local people, which is referred to in one of the letters. So they were probably very brave men who had to deal with very difficult circumstances in terms of the danger of being in the Fens, but also the opposition of the locals. He wasn't just a surveyor. They trusted him so much that they actually gave him the job of managing some of the works, including the Marshland Cut. Moore is remarkable in that there's almost no mention of any dissatisfaction with him, apart from a few occasions when things were a bit late to be done because of its enormous workload. Just go on to some of the other key people. Robert Burton was the principal overseer. He was appointed quite early in 1650. Initially his work was very well received. He was basically the site manager. He told people what to do. He ordered materials. He arranged contracts. He delivered the work. Vermeulen planned it, but he delivered it. However, In 1651, the company noticed that some of the contracts from Burton had been let out at very excessive rates, and this was investigated further, particularly by John Thurlow, and he found that Burton was engaged in clandestine bargains with his favourites, which you would imagine means he was putting out the contracts at too high rates and receiving some remuneration, backhanders, as a result. A practice that's happened many times before and since. Other problems arose with the takers and how he dealt with them. On some occasions he made only verbal agreements with the takers, and that caused problems afterwards when some of the works were not built properly. In the end, his contract was terminated and he ceased to work on the drainage. He actually died in 1654. Christian Derrickson, another interesting man, he designed and built the sluices and bridges. A very skilled activity involving huge timbers, ropes, all joined together in a very complex structure. And some guide to this, the sasses and sluices at Salter's Load cost £3,240, which was an enormous sum in those days. But again, the relationship with him was difficult. And in 1651, the company thought that he was delaying his work to prejudice another engineer called Glosson, and they actually withheld payment to him to force him to get on with the work. In November 1651, they wrote to him and said, "The bargain with Christian of setting the sluices by the 1st of August will cause him to use double diligence, seeing his neglect and default have turned too much to the company's prejudice." So they were dissatisfied with him, as they were with many others. William Jessup was also a very interesting man. He was the company's receiver, also accountant and auditor, and he was sent down to the Fens on several occasions to audit the works down there, and returned and gave a negative account of what he'd found. In 1651, he said that the accounting methods used by the company were very unsafe, particularly in relation to materials and the payment of their workers. Turning to some of the other officers, in 1653, the company ordered an examination of the miscarriages of their officers, as has been employed in the works of draining the Great Level, and this clearly follows some dissatisfaction with what had been going on. The report on these workers is very interesting. John Cooley was described as negligent. George Barnes was considered dangerous to the company's profit and service. Edmund Welsh was slow and diverted by his private occasions. Geoffrey Hawkins not fit and to be discontinued. Thomas More, a useless officer. William Palmer, seldom observed to be on the works. Richard Kendall, unfit to be employed further. Anthony Ringwood had carried himself well after initial problems. Henry Finnemore was a stout man, but in other respects not well qualified for the company's service. So it's a very negative report, and these were most of the officers. It wasn't just a handful of them they're reporting on. Only Arthur Tench received praise as able and fit to be continued. So this reflects this great difficulty the company seems to have had to find competent and skilled workers to carry out the drainage works. It may also just reflect their impatience, the huge burden of work they placed on these men. It was impossible for them to achieve what the company wanted when there were so few of them. I think there was very much two sides to this story. Now we'll turn to the labourers themselves. As I said before, there was this vast army of labourers, and they had a lot of problems with them, mainly because they failed to pay them on time. This is because they ran out of money, or because the money was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This first occurred in October 1649. They did run out of money then, and the workers fell into mutiny and seized upon the officers and threatened to carry them away and cut them in pieces. In April 1652, the payday, when they lined up the men to pay them, was 14, some say 19 weeks late. And because of the ill pay, a lot of the workers had left to do work elsewhere, even though the pay was lower, because the company had been so bad at paying them. Other later similar occasions, the company's agents were exclaimed upon, cursed and threatened. Another problem occurred in 1650 when the workers became aware that they were receiving clipped money, and this was money that had been cut around the edges to reduce its value, which the company denied had been their fault, that others had been responsible. The company had a very difficult relationship with their workers, and remember, these are very poor men, wild men in some ways. Many had probably fought in the Civil War in one way or another, and they were very quick to mutiny and move to violence if they were crossed. Just going to the other end of the scale, Oliver Cromwell, although he didn't have any direct involvement in the drainage, was a key man in the story. As I mentioned earlier, right at the start of the process, they thank him clearly for the help he gave them in passing the Act of Drainage. But he does appear on several occasions later. Another interesting event occurred in 1652 when Cromwell ordered members of the adventurers to see him in London and discuss a petition from Over. This is a village in Cambridgeshire near to where Cromwell grew up. He owned land near there, and he wanted to discuss the case and dissatisfaction of the local people to the drainage works there. They were represented by General Fleetwood, another very important general in the Civil War. That took a long time to resolve. It was quite acrimonious. Cromwell also intervened when there was resistance against the drainage and riots. He ordered his troops to go down to Swaffham to quell the violence there. In May 1654 he issued an ordinance for the preservation of the works of the great level of the Fens, and that provided the adventurers with much increased powers to penalise landowners who failed to pay their tax, but also to prosecute anyone who was against the works. So through that ordinance they could sequester the lands of the opponents. They could also force them to work on the drainage works if they failed to provide recompense for the damage that they'd done. Another very interesting story was that out of the blue, Cromwell wrote to the company to say he owned 200 acres in the middle of the Great Level near Ramsey. They investigated this. They couldn't really see that he did own it. It was owned by others. But Cromwell was insistent. He said he'd raise a petition against the company if this was not resolved in his favour. Obviously, naturally, they bent over backwards to accommodate him because he was such a powerful man and so influential in helping them. And finally, they sold the land from the people who owned it. They sold other land, and Cromwell got his 200 acres in the end. Very interesting as well that this correspondence is taking place almost at the same time as Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament and became the Lord Protector of England and the Commonwealth. So these are massive events of state were occurring at the same time Cromwell was becoming mildly obsessed or interested in this very small plot of land that he believed was his, which I'm sure says something about his personality. I'm going to now turn to the Scottish prisoners of war, which we covered in the previous project, so I won't say too much, but just it is very much part of the story, so I'll go through it briefly. As I mentioned earlier, the Civil War continued during the early part of our period. In 1650 there was a great battle between Cromwell's parliamentary forces and the Scots at Dunbar. Many soldiers were captured, and then a year later there was another battle at Worcester. Now, prior to the battle, a lot of Cromwell's troops had been in Scotland opposing the Scots. There'd been sort of small battles, skirmishes. The Scots were hemmed in. They decided, led by Charles II, Charles I's son, who'd come back from the continent to lead the Scottish forces, they decided to break out of Scotland, move down the West Country, trying to gather more troops. The Royalist side had always been stronger in the West Country. Also, Presbyterians, they hoped might join the Scottish forces. They carried on down. There were sort of minor battles with Cromwell, and then eventually it resulted in a great battle at Worcester. Cromwell overwhelmingly defeated the Scots. Many prisoners of war were taken, many thousands, and several of those thousands were moved to London, a prisoner of war camp called Tothill Fields. From there, many were taken and moved to the Fens to work in the drainage works. The main reason the Scottish prisoners were deployed in the Fens was because the Council of State wanted to dispose of them in a way that would keep them safe, would prevent them from rebelling further, and not upsetting the locals too much and not starving them to death. The previous year, many thousands of soldiers captured at Dunbar had been moved to Durham, and in Durham Cathedral in particular, and many hundreds, possibly thousands, have died of starvation and disease. And there's another whole history around that you can explore by just Googling. There's many studies by Durham University on that. They didn't want this to happen again. So the deployment was more to do with the Council of State's need than the company's desire to have the prisoners. But on the other hand, the company would receive cheap labour. It would be a very flexible workforce. They could move them around as they wanted without having to arrange contracts, without having to deal with the takers. So there were some clear advantages for the company. And remember, they were running out of money constantly at this time, so any cheap way to deliver the works was received and welcomed. But they were very fearful as well, bringing these unruly soldiers into the already unstable mix of the Fens. Now, if you imagine these prisoners in London, they must have been in a dreadful state. They'd marched hundreds of miles, they'd been starved throughout much of that process, they'd fought in a violent and bloody battle, they'd been in prisoners of war camps, in insanitary conditions with disease. So the reality probably was that most of them were unfit to work. So they gathered those that were hale and hearty, without wives or children, and moved some to the Fens. It was a relatively small number, below 500 compared to the thousands of prisoners who were captured. Once they were there, they caused the company a lot of problems. Many tried to run away, many probably resisted against being forced to work. And to keep this under control, Parliament issued an order that any soldiers who ran away would be proceeded against by martial law and punished with death without mercy. They put posters up around the Fens to warn them against this. They prosecuted some, but still some ran away. Every month they had to send back to the Council of State the numbers that were still there, the numbers that had escaped, the numbers that had died. If too many ran away, they'd be fined as well. So they were keen for this not to happen. An interesting incident, a Provost Marshal called Johnson, who was tasked with guarding the prisoners, allowed a large number to escape, and he was then arrested and sent to trial at a court of war and was even threatened with execution. This is covered in great detail in the previous project, and you can look into this, but it was a very remarkable story. I'm just going to show a film now from the previous project. This is the other thing the Word Garden likes to do, is just try to explore the past and imagine what it was like, not just to relay the facts, but to consider what it was actually like for these people at the time. I'll just play it now.
So we worked from dawn to dusk. We just knew how to work hard on a farm, but not like this. Within the drain it were wet and cold all the time. The secret was to remain dry as long as you could. On the first day here, I slipped off the plank and fell in the water. Soaked. It took days to get dry. If you worked too close to the next man, you get splashed again and again by his spade. But if you stood too far off, no one would be there to grab you if you fell. The clothes they gave us took days to get dry. If you fell in and you got soaked right through, we tried to hang them up at night, but they were almost as wet the next day. The air was so damp. But the planks and the banks were so slippery, it were almost impossible not to fall. We were sent down to dig out the big drains at first. and shift mud onto the high bank with barrow and bucket. I preferred digging. It was harder work, but there was less chance you'd fall in and get soaked right through. Some days it were too wet to dig. Instead we worked at the top, shifting the mud, blasted by the wind and the rain so hard it blew you off your feet. Sometimes the bank would slip and try to bury us alive. You'd have to scramble away as fast as you could. After the mud gets so thick around your legs, you just can't move. After a few weeks of this, your legs start to rot, itch and stink and raw. Being so cold all the time was the worst thing. It got so deep in your bones it just stayed there. Even with the hard work, you'd sweat because of the work, but still stay cold deep in your bones. They throb with the pain of the cold. Sorry. I can see you're bored with this. Just to say, it were hell, complete hell, brutal, wet and cold. Hell. Imagine the wettest and coldest you've ever been in your life. Close your eyes and imagine. Go on. Humour me. Close them. Please. Then imagine you can't ever go home and get work. Instead, it goes on for day after a day until you get so weak you just can't fight the cold. Cold is all you have. Cold is your entire being. Close your eyes. Go on. Please. Just look at you. I can see you've no notion of what it were like for us. It wasn't the cold as much as the being a way out of it. How could you know what it were like for us back then, in your clothes and hats and warm beds? Some of the men got so sick with the cold, many we'd not see again. Sometimes, when I were digging, I'd close my eyes and imagine I were back in Scotland, on the farm. Mother's food waiting for us, a fire to go back to thaw out our bones when we stopped work. I'd close my eyes, try to think of home. But then I'd look up, see I was still in this great cut in the earth, another part of hell. Sometimes they send us out in the fen, digging the division dikes or digging out clay to line the drains or cutting away the reeds and sedge and grass to make the land bare. Brutal it was out there. The wind would cut right through you. The only thing left was to hope you could make it through to the spring. Sorry, that's not true. There's one more thing. Running away and getting the hell out of there. Every day there was so much talk of running off, making sure the English dikers couldn't hear us. Several of the lads had gone. We didn't know how far they got, though. Kelsey said they'd been shot, but we knew he was a liar.
As well as the Scottish prisoners, there were Dutch prisoners of war. These were captured at a naval battle in Goodwin Sands in the English Channel, North Sea, in May 1652. Many were captured. These were sailors, not soldiers, but eventually 500 of these men were moved to the Fens in June 1653. given spades and shovels as with the previous workers. In this case they were put in huts to lodge in, which may have happened with the Scottish soldiers, but there's no reference to it. They were kept near Swaffham, Cottenham and Waterbeach, where soldiers had already been stationed to quell some of the riots and problems that had occurred there. But it turned out a rather fruitless exercise for the company. The locals encouraged them to run away, they refused to work. The company complained that they were a great burden to them, they being resolved not to work, nor will work, and say they are prisoners of war and ought not to be forced to labour. Unlike the Scots, who were a defeated nation, the Dutch were not. Although there were battles between England and the Netherlands were not defeated. They were a very, very powerful European country. So their people, their prisoners of war, were in a much stronger position than the Scots. And probably the Council of State did not want to offend the Dutch, whereas they could really do what they liked with the Scots because they had been defeated completely. So it's been unclear, as with many things in the minute books, when they disappeared, but presumably when the war between the countries ended, they were returned to the Netherlands. Just to say one thing about the minute books is, which is quite frustrating, they go into great detail about things and then suddenly they cease to be mentioned. And I think we have to bear in mind these are minutes, so minutes of meetings. So the purpose of those meetings was to make decisions. So if there was no need for a decision on a particular subject, they're not mentioned at all. That doesn't mean things were not happening, but there's just no information on them. I'm just going to turn now towards what the company actually did. So what was the work they did? These maps show each year what the company did. Much greater detail is provided in the documentation related to the project that I mentioned earlier. As we can see, it shows which drains were present. These different coloured dots show which type of works it was, whether it was a bank, a bridge, a drain, a river, a road or a sluice. In the beginning, a lot of the work was at the north end of the Great Level near Peterborough. But then in 1651, this is when a lot of the work occurred. So the 100-foot river was created, Vermuyden's drain, now the 40-foot, was created. These immense channels. This was the key period of the works in many ways, and this is when the Scots were there. Next year, there were some more drains. Thurlow's drain was added, Hammond's O. They did a lot more work around the level, building drains, scouring them out, building sluices. And as time progresses, a lot of work in this period, in 1653, was on roads. Now they built a lot of roads. This was essential for the adventurers to gain profit from their land. They needed to be able to move workers to the land. If they grew crops, they needed to take the crops away to take to market. So the roads are absolutely essential, and they did a lot of building of roads in this period, far less documented than the work on the drains. But still, I think many of the roads in the Fens can be traced back to the adventurers. Going on through the period, towards the end of the period, it's more to do with repair and dredging of drains, for example, repairing banks. One thing that is evident from the minute books is that a lot of the work they did was not done in a way where the assets would continue for a long time. They decayed very rapidly. For example, the banks seemed to crack and drop quite quickly, and this was probably because they were built to some extent with peat, and that is a very poor substrate to create banks from. It starts to waste and contract, levels drop. As you can see by a lot of the bumpy roads in the Fens, that's the cause of that. They did probably try to reinforce them, but overall they decay quite quickly. The drains filled up. It's very clear maintenance was just as important as construction. And towards the end of the period, this is mainly what they do, repair and other activities. Every dot on that map, there's some detail in the documentation of what actually happened at that location at what time. There's not that much about the engineering works, but there is some. So they started the process by what was called lock spitting, and that was marking out the route, by digging a narrow trench and also putting in posts so that when it came to dig the drains or make the roads, that the other workers knew exactly where to do it. Then huge armies of men dug these great channels, as I said before. There's mention of a lot of work on banks with back floors, are mentioned many times. Frustratingly, it's not really clear what back floors meant, but it's something to do with creating a base for the banks, I think, because I think if you put a large amount of heavy material just on peat without reinforcing it, they would sink very rapidly. Bottoming of the rivers is another process that's mentioned on several occasions without much detail, but I imagine it was to do with reinforcing the channel. So if you imagine it was dug into peat, once a large flow went through that would be eroded very rapidly. So they probably put things like clay along the banks and along the bottom, and perhaps gravel to make them much stronger. For example, the bottoming of the 100-foot river took a lot longer than actually digging it. It took between about September 1651 and July 1652. They'd only taken 5 months to build the Great Drain. So this must have been a very difficult, hard process. Men deep in these drains in very wet, unpleasant conditions. In the case of the 100-foot river, this was mainly in the winter. When they finished this, though, there was a dam at the end of the drain that sort of blocked it off from the pre-existing river courses. This was removed, so this was a great moment of tension, no doubt, and some danger, you'd imagine, removing a great earthen bank to let the water of the Bedford Ouse, for example, one of the biggest rivers in England, to flow through it. As well, they built sluices and sasses. So sluices, much like today, managed the water level. Sasses were more like locks, they let boats through. Huge teams of builders and carpenters were needed to do this. As I said, they built many highways. There is a bit of detail in the minute books how they did it. They laid sedge upon the ground, on the wet ground, and then they put gravel on top of this. On each side, they created drains and pulled out the material from those drains and banked each side. And they also built many bridges, and there is information on the bridges. They actually moved one bridge from one place to another, so they built the frame at Erith and then they moved it further to the north on the request of the people from Sutton. Again, many carpenters were employed in this work. So that's what they did. But as I said, they faced great problems, not just in finance, not just in corruption, but also just dealing with engineering. And one of the things obviously that was a danger to them was the weather. This talk is being given in the autumn 2022. It's been one of the wettest autumns on record. If that had occurred in 1651 or 1652, they would have had great problems. But they were very lucky in that it was a very dry period, one of the driest periods in the history of England at the time. Extremely hot, some of the hottest summers they'd ever had. The winters were mild and dry. They were extremely fortunate. But despite this, there were some periods that were wet, when the water levels were high. And in 1651, in November, the bank of the old Bedford River burst and released water across the drainage works, which delayed much of the work taking place there at the time. The company obviously were very concerned about this. They investigated it. They identified three possibilities. One was that bank had been built just as all the others, and that was the thing they most feared, because if that bank could break, any of the banks could break. Another option that was bad was sabotage, because to break a huge bank like the one beside the Bedford River would be an enormous task for any saboteur, so their opponents would have had to be very confident and resourceful to do that. A less bad option was just that bit of the bank wasn't built well, because then they could just make it up like the rest of the banks. That was another possibility. The one actually that they decided upon was that another drain had been built too close to that bank and had undermined it, and in the end they filled in that drain and built another one. As I mentioned, the minute book is very patchy in the information it gives. So I found in another record in the archive of really bad floods in December 1655, Much of the area was flooded, some of the banks broke down, but it's barely mentioned in the minute book. So it just reveals that things happened in this period. As I said before, although there was a lot of detail in the minute books, it doesn't tell us everything by any means. The final main topic I'll talk about is the resistance of the local people to the drainage. It's well known that the myth of the Fen tigers stems from this resistance, and it isn't difficult to imagine why. A way of life had been established in which many of the people put out their cattle on the commons in the summer, and then in the winter they gained income by catching fish and wildfowl, and there was endless food for the people to eat as a result. That was overturned by the drainage work. So this huge area of wetness and wildness turned into an area of ownership and exclusion and engineering, which in some ways it still is today. That isn't to say that everyone was against the drainage. There were some parts of the Fens that were so disrupted by flooding that the people there were very welcoming towards the drainage. So it was a mixed story. It wasn't just everyone was opposed to it. But in the whole, there was opposition by the local people to the drainage. The map here shows where the main disturbances occurred against the drainage works. First, I'll show you this film, which just explores, this is from a previous project again, the argument between the locals and the adventurers. Again, just trying to look at these things in a different way to bring them to life.
We're going to talk to you about coal seed, rapeseed, corn and grain, about winter grounds, about how the land is going to be worth 2 or 3 times more what it is now, how there'll be more food, we'll escape the floods, how wretched our lives have been all these years. No, what a lot of nonsense. They've got nothing to do. Well, I've always lived round here. I was a fen man, a marsh man, that's what I is. And all I'll ever be, for better or worse. Well, what am I supposed to do, eh? Just sit around here and let them steal our limbs. Oh, look at you. Well, how would you feel, eh? If someone came to your land and said they were going to take it away, buy you from your cattle, take away the land where you feed your family. How would you feel, eh? I know you look at me and you think he's wretched, he's wild, he don't matter. But that's just the same for me, you know. I've been taking my cattle out onto that summer ground for as long as summer's followed spring. Right. Now they cut channels, they build banks, and I can't even bring my cows out onto the poor grounds. The poor grounds, they say, they've left us. They're taking the best land for themselves, you know. Oh, yeah. Right. Those undertakers, that's what we call them. Up there in London, chattering and babbling away, telling us what's good, what's bad. None of them come from round here. How come they think they knows what's good for us, eh? Be quiet. Hurry up. Quiet.
For everyone like you, I can find you 3 who have had their summer grounds flooded, or their houses washed away, or have nothing to eat when the winters come and freeze the land. Surely you know this is true. You also know that the drainage has been so bad with the silting up of the river outfalls and the flooding of the summer grounds, it can't be left to get worse and worse. The Commissioner of Shores made this clear. We've only done what they said must be done for years. Surely you know this is true. The drainage work will provide food for the cattle in the winter sown, or can graze on the summer meadows. Provide more food, more money, more wealth for all of us.
Nonsense.
The ague and the foul air will disperse, and we're not taking all of the land, just a third of it. Allow me to tell you what we have planned. It is essential in these hard times that we think of the wealth of the nation. After all we've been through, abundant grains and foods will protect the Commonwealth. And because the king has gone, this means that there will be more for all of us.
What about our Commonwealth, eh? What about them? They go back to start time.
Well, pays for his armies and ships to keep safe our way of life. The Dutch and the French won't care a fig for a man like him. They'll take all of the land.
So they help and steal our land.
I assure you, we'll not get rich from this. No man has ever got rich from drainage. The expense so great, the risk so high.
So why are you here then?
For the general good, as Parliament has decided. They decide what is required for the general good. Nonsense.
Another event that occurred, which I called the Great Turf Cutting, occurred again in November 1651. This was a very bad period. One of the audio plays that you can also access from this project covers this period when lots and lots of things happened all at the same time. The Scots prisoners, the breaking of the bank of the Bedford River, etc. But also in this period, the company learnt that a very large area of land up near Ramsey had been cut for turf. And for those not familiar, because the peat is organic material, you can cut it and put it into turfs and dry it and then use it on fires, and this was used extensively in the region and was in Ireland, for example, until very recently as a form of fuel. What happened was, over 1,500 acres, a huge area, turf was cut by the local people and laid out to dry, and it seems that the reason was that they were aware that this land was to be lost from them, from their common ownership, and before that happened, they wanted to take what they could from it. The company were very annoyed as well, not surprisingly. They seized all the turf and they put a guard of soldiers to prevent anyone removing it. They also seized 30,000 pieces of turf in Cambridge and issued a writ to have a man called Stevens arrested, and then he was sent to trial in Westminster. This was a huge event. To cut that area, 1,500 acres, in quite a short period of time must have involved many, many hundreds of men. So it just shows you that there was resistance against the change of way of life. It was probably hopeless resistance, and I'm sure they knew at the time this was the case, but they could try to get what they could from the land before it was lost to them. They put soldiers up there, and eventually they forced the locals to give them other land because they considered this land too damaged to be of use to them, which probably was unreasonable. But still, they gained more land as a result because they took other land in the vicinity adjacent to the areas that had been cut. Swaffham is an example, the biggest event really in terms of riots against the drainage. So it began in 1652. A man called Thomas Raintree gave a report of throwing in of some of the dikes by the commoners. So they threw mud back into the drains, they tried to break down the banks. They put a squadron of horse soldiers there in January 1653. Then in April, 150 men gathered and expelled the company's workmen and threatened them and harassed them, and they ran away. And then they began throwing in the dikes again. So that really involved cutting the banks, just throwing material back in to the drains. The company wrote to Cromwell and asked for support, and he issued a warrant to send a troop of soldiers under Major Parker to suppress the uprising, which they did. And then other incidents occurred, particularly in this area around Soham, Bottisham, Swaffham. Other troops were sent down there, others were put sort of in reserve, ready to go if they were needed. Similar events occurred elsewhere, perhaps not on such a scale, but in Holme, Ramsey, Woodwater, Willingham, Hockford, and many others. The impression is that these were reactive events, so a drain was built and the men couldn't take their cattle to the land, or they couldn't move their goods from one place to another, and became very angry. And although there was general view against the drainage, resistance seems to have flared up on this local level. It doesn't seem to have been particularly coordinated. Two things to remember in this. One was that the population of the Fens was very low, so there were not huge numbers of people to resist the drainage works. And two, after the Civil War, during the Civil War, there were very large numbers of soldiers available to quell any resistance. And these were controlled ultimately by the Council of State in London, by Cromwell himself, and they could deploy these troops as they wished. If you go back in time to an earlier time like the First Undertaking, this was not the case. There were not many soldiers in the country. Putting down riots and resistance was far, far more difficult. But for these reasons, any resistance was essentially futile, because England was really a military state at the time, and much like we see in other countries today, like China and other places, they could quell resistance. If they needed, they had the power to do it. This was reinforced by the Ordinance for the Preservation of the Works of the Great Level of the Fens that was issued by Cromwell in May 1654, and this gave the company much greater powers, one, to sequester land and penalise anyone who had failed to pay their taxes, but also to prosecute anyone who resisted the works. They could take their land, they could take their property, they could even force them to work on the drainage works, the people who had resisted them, or send them to a house of correction or prison. It also ordered the local authorities to be much more bold in quelling the resistance, whereas before they turned a blind eye on many occasions. They hadn't acted because these were people they knew, they were the local people, and many of the local justices of the peace may well have been against the drainage. So this pushed the balance of power much more against the resistance, and really very much ended the resistance. There's very little after 1654. Finally, I'll just mention the petition in November 1653 that was brought to the Committee of Parliament for Petitions, and this is believed to have been led by a man called John Maynard, who had been against the drainage for many years during the period preceding the Act of Drainage as well. And they claimed that the drainage had not been effective. It in many cases made things worse on the land, and it also prejudiced the navigation between King's Lynn and Cambridge and across the Fens in general. The company knew this was coming, but it didn't come forward, and then they brought witnesses together to resist it, and then they had to send them home, and then suddenly they heard that this meeting, that Parliament was looking at this petition on the 17th of November. They were given no notice. They turned up to make their case, but the committee replied that they were not pleased to hear them on it, so they refused to take their evidence. Possibly the politics was shifting in Parliament against the drainers. They raised their own petition, and the case they made was they spent vast amounts of money on the works at their own expense. They claimed 300,000 at the time. That the men who made the adjudication with great integrity, ordered, commissioned by Parliament, they were not biased, they made a level judgment, and that to overturn the judgment of commissions of Parliament was a very bad precedent and could be easily applied to any other decision made by Parliament. That was their case. But what happened was that within 3 weeks Cromwell dissolved Parliament and became Lord Protector, and we don't hear any further about this petition, so presumably because Parliament wasn't sitting they couldn't hear it further, so it just sort of died away, to the great pleasure of the company, no doubt. Despite all these problems, the final adjudication took place in Ely in March 1653, and that judged that the whole level had been successfully drained. Previously, a similar decision had been made for the north part of the level at meetings at Peterborough and Wisbeach in 1651. This meant that the adventurers could gain their reward of land, this huge area of land that they'd been promised, and make profits from it. This was a key moment, but again, it's all to do with politics. They hadn't really finished the drainage works in 1651, they hadn't really finished the drainage works in 1653. It's very difficult to judge whether drainage had been successful just on a very short visit. It really depended on what the weather conditions were, if there were floods, if there were heavy rainfall. The situation would be very different from the days where they viewed it. But still, they made that decision. The company threw everything at these meetings. They gave horses to the commissioners, they escorted them down, they paid great money to feed them and accommodate them. Cromwell's own troop accompanied the commissioners around the level. They ordered boats to take them on trips. Everything they could think of they did to make the experience of the adjudication as good as possible for the commissioners. And as a result, and because the drainage had been successful to a large extent, they gained the outcome that they wanted. Vermuyden gave a great speech. It's in the minute books at this final adjudication. It's quite impressive, his kind of logic or his case. His final line was this: "I presume not to say more of the works, lest I should be accounted vainglorious, although I might truly affirm that the present or former age have done nothing like it for the great good of the nation." When you read this speech, it's very much about Vermuyden himself. He mentions very few others. The disputes with the company are obviously not mentioned, and I could just imagine the other adventurers sitting in that room as Vermuyden gave his great speech, squirming in the knowledge of how difficult he'd made their lives over the previous years. We're almost at the end of the talk now. As I said before, this has been a very quick run through the stories contained in this archive. There's much, much more in the transcriptions themselves, obviously, but also in the summary, and if you'd like to explore those, please look at those. Perhaps relate it to your own interests or the part of the Fens where you live. Before I leave, I'd also like to show you some of the other outputs. So this is the history walk. It's not quite ready. As I said, it's with the Fen Edge. It will be available on their website in the next few months. And you can walk around along that route that you can see there. Each stop, there's a maybe 5-minute clip of me talking about similar things to those that I've just presented to you. It's a really nice walk as well. That's the 100-foot river in the picture. I'll just show you briefly some outputs from that walk and also from the audio plays. And the idea of the audio plays was to bring the story to life in a different way. So there's 3 plays. One is about the Scottish soldiers, and another is about the Swaffham riots that I mentioned, and another is the correspondence between Anthony Hammond and Robert Henley, who I mentioned quite early on in this talk. As I said, the philosophy of the word garden is very much not only to discover hidden history, but also to share it and try to bring it to life. Try to imagine what it was like for the people living in those times. Very difficult to do, of course, but I think through imagining what it was like, it really does bring history to life and allow us to see it in a new way. Just like to say a few words of introduction. So first of all, thank you very much for going on this history walk.
Slowly the birds settled, and once we'd set off, when we walked down there, the enormous flocks of widgeon and teal and snipe, slowly they'd return as we lay there, maybe for 30 minutes, but it always seemed like hours when you were there. Although we could look at each other, we couldn't make a sound. It was our job to know when to move. If you moved too soon, 2 food birds came down. Too long, you'd use up the day.
And didn't they tell us so what were on my mind? I couldn't trust them with Kelsey there. Finally, I thought I could see a way out. I escaped when it were near dusk. and the day's work were coming to its end. Enough light was left to make my way down through the meadows.
If the bank was made well, as planned, and still burst, then all our banks made equally well can burst, which means we have built our house on sand. If the bank was badly made, how many more are like this? If such a great bank was destroyed willfully by our opponents, they have truly grown bold. Tell me, which of these is worse?
Just to end, I just want to show you where you can obtain the information that I've mentioned in this presentation. So the minute books, transcriptions, all 5 of them, and the summary can be downloaded from the Internet Archive. There's a link below this video, but if that doesn't work, you just go into the Internet Archive and search for the word Proceedings of the Adventurers Summary and Index, and it will pop up. There's 6 documents, there's a summary and 5 others. You can download them, they're PDFs, you can then read them on your computer. The History Walk guide is still being worked upon with the Fen Edge, so that will be available in the next few months, and hopefully I'd quite like to lead a walk there in the spring if possible, so you're very welcome to join that. I'll communicate that nearer the time. Alongside that, as I mentioned before, there's a sort of podcast, a sound trail, and that can be downloaded again from the Internet Archive, and then in this case just type in Erith History Walk and you'll find that link, and you can download as a file that you can play on your phone, take along with the walk. It's also available, the History Walk and the audio dramas are also available on SoundCloud. Just type in Peter Daldorf and you'll find them, or you can download them again from the Internet Archive, this time search with the word Swaffen. The GIS layers for the maps are also available, and you can download these. There's a link underneath this video, and then you just go to the website and click on the map download link to download those files, which you can, as I said, you need a package like QGIS to look at them. Just to finally mention a couple of other things, so please look at the Word Garden website to learn more about other projects if you're interested. There's my own website, which is shown there, wildhead.co.uk. The Scottish Soldier film is there for you to look at. And on the Word Garden's website, there's a contact page. You can type in a message to contact us if you wish. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you for listening, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of the project outputs.